Imagine a world where every tooth could be a death sentence, where pain wasn't just a companion, but the master of existence, where medicine felt more like torture than salvation, and ignorance was the only rule. In this darkness of the 17th century lived a man named Pierre Fauchard. He was self-taught, cast into the abyss of medical barbarism, a simple surgeon without academic titles or recognition. Yet he wasn't merely a witness to the chaos. He did the unthinkable. He systematized knowledge that didn't exist, invented dozens of instruments, and developed revolutionary treatment methods. He became the father of modern dentistry, and something incredible happened. He freed millions from the grip of suffering, laying the foundation for an entirely new science. We tend to think of great discoveries as a flash of genius, a eureka moment, when a solitary mind suddenly perceives the truth, illuminating the world. But reality is far more prosaic, far more brutal. True progress is always a battle, a long, exhausting struggle against ignorance, against ingrained misconceptions, against pain that was once considered an inevitable part of life. It's not an instantaneous revelation. It's persistent effort, decades of meticulous observation, hundreds of mistakes leading to breakthroughs, thousands of failures hardening the will. Pierre Fauchard's story is vivid proof of this. It's not about myths. It's about how true, monumental science is born from despair and absolute ignorance, and how one person can change the world without waiting for a miracle. In the 17th century, medical science remained a prisoner of medieval dogmas. 1,000 years prior, Galen and Hippocrates laid the foundations, but their teachings had become unshakable truths, beyond question. Any attempt to doubt them, any pursuit of empirical knowledge, was considered heresy, a threat to authority. Doctors, or those who called themselves such, relied not on observation, but on ancient, decaying treatises. Diagnosis was often a mystical pronouncement, and treatment a ritual with no connection to reality. Surgeons, if they could even be called that, operated by guesswork. They knew nothing of anatomy. They didn't understand the causes of diseases. The only tool was often a knife, and the only method, blind intervention. Wounds were cauterized with hot irons or scalded with boiling oil. Pus was considered laudable, a sign of cleansing, not deadly infection. Anesthesia? Only alcohol or opium, if one was lucky. Hygiene was out of the question. Any operation carried a mortal threat. A simple cut could lead to gangrene, a tooth extraction, to blood poisoning. Illness wasn't treated. It was endured, or one died. Death was commonplace. Pain was an everyday reality. No one expected salvation from doctors, rather, a quick end. This world was permeated with fear and helplessness in the face of an invisible enemy, disease, and it was a world that awaited its savior, though it didn't know it. At 22, Pierre Fauchard found himself at the epicenter of this medical nightmare. He served as a surgeon on French naval ships. He saw not just wounds. He witnessed the putrefaction of flesh, screams of pain, and helplessness in the face of death, which claimed not only those wounded in battle, but also those struck by the simplest infection. Every day was a lesson in survival, or a lesson in demise. There, amidst the salty wind and the smell of blood, he observed how wounds, treated with ancient recipes, inevitably festered, how a simple dental abscess became a mortal threat, claiming the life of a healthy man in a few days. He saw that the teachings of Galen and Hippocrates, once great, were now just empty dogmas. They didn't save. They killed. This daily carnage bred in him not despair, but a burning curiosity. He could not accept death as the norm. He could not reconcile with pain that knew no comfort. He began to seek answers. In every scream, in every decaying body, in every fruitless attempt at treatment, he saw not fate, but a challenge. Pierre Fauchard was not an academic. He had no degrees. His university became the decks of ships and the infirmaries, where death was the best teacher and suffering the only constant. It was there, amidst suffering and ignorance, that he began to realize, to save lives, one must not follow rules. One must create them. One day, in a stuffy ship's infirmary, where the air was thick with the smell of pus and fear, Pierre Fauchard faced another challenge. A young sailor, barely 20, writhed on a bunk. His face was distorted by a monstrous swelling, and a stench of decaying flesh came from his mouth. A tooth. Ordinary but deadly, caries had turned it into a hotbed of infection threatening his entire head. Fauchard had seen this hundreds of times. He knew that traditional remedies, foul-smelling poultices of herbs and alcohol, were useless. They didn't save. They only prolonged the agony. And then, inspecting the supplies, he found that even these meaningless remedies were gone. Completely. Nothing left. This wasn't a crisis. It was an opportunity. Before him lay not just a patient, but a living question. If the old methods don't work, if they're not even available, then what? He looked at the sailor, looked at the blackened, eroded hole in the tooth, and in his mind, like a flash of lightning, a thought flickered. What if the disease isn't external, but internal? What if it's not a curse, but destruction that can be stopped? Fauchard wasn't a scholar. He was a practitioner. He sought a solution. His gaze fell on a small piece of tin lying among the ship's junk. Metal. Malleable. Could it be possible? He remembered how carpenters patched cracks in wood, how blacksmiths filled flaws in metal. Why couldn't one fill a hole in a tooth? This was madness by the standards of the time, but madness is sometimes the only path to truth. He took a small, thin iron hook, a tool typically used to clean cannon barrels, and carefully, millimeter by millimeter, began to clean the decayed tissue from the sailor's tooth. Each scrape was agony for the patient, but Fauchard worked with the concentration of a sculptor. He was removing not just pain, but its source. Then, melting a piece of tin over a candle flame, he carefully, using the same hook, began to fill the meticulously cleaned cavity. The metal solidified, forming a dense filling. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a solution that hadn't existed. Having finished the work, Fauchard stepped back. The sailor, exhausted but no longer screaming in unbearable pain, carefully moved his jaw. The pain didn't vanish instantly, but it noticeably receded. Within a few hours, the swelling began to subside. Within a day, his temperature normalized. Within a week, the sailor returned to his duties. The tooth was saved. Not pulled, not cauterized. Saved. This single case, this audacious experiment, sowed the seed of a new paradigm in Fauchard's mind. He understood. A tooth is not just a bone to be removed at the slightest problem. It is a complex organ that can and should be treated. Treated, not mutilated. This was not just the invention of the filling. It was the birth of the idea of preserving teeth. That pain could be eliminated, not endured. And that a surgeon should not be an executioner. He should be a healer. One saved tooth. It was a triumph. But for Pierre Fauchard, it was just the beginning. He didn't stop. He didn't rest on his laurels. He saw not just a method, but an entire world of possibilities. His genius lay not in a single flash of insight, but in a methodical, almost obsessive search for truth. His laboratory became not university halls, but the beds of suffering patients. His textbooks, not ancient treatises, but living bodies. He observed with keen clinical precision. He didn't just look, he saw. Every inflamed gum pocket, every blackened root, every aching jaw was for him not just a symptom, but a riddle demanding a solution. He recorded the smallest details, the color, smell, consistency of pus, the reaction to touch, meticulously, as if gathering evidence. He compared thousands of observations, thousands of cases. He sought patterns where others saw only chaos and curses. And he made mistakes, many times. But each failure was not a setback for him, but a valuable lesson. If a method didn't work, he didn't retreat. He analyzed. Why? What went wrong? Where was the mistake made? He changed his approach and tried again. This was a continuous cycle. Observation, hypothesis, experiment, analysis, correction. A cycle that became the cornerstone of all modern science, but back then, an absolute revelation, a challenge to a 1,000-year tradition of blindly following dogmas. Soon Fauchard understood. New medicine required new instruments. The old ones were crude, barbaric, designed for extraction, not for treatment. He needed precision, delicacy, and he began to create them himself. He worked with watchmakers, jewelers, blacksmiths. He explained his ideas, drew sketches, experimented with different metals and shapes. He created forceps that gripped the tooth without crumbling it, probes capable of exploring deep cavities, instruments for polishing, for filling. Each new instrument was an embodiment of his understanding of anatomy and mechanics, born from thousands of practical needs. This was not just a set of iron tools. It was an arsenal for a new, precise war against disease, where accuracy replaced brute force. But his revolution could not remain within the walls of infirmaries. Fauchard understood, knowledge must spread. But how? Academic works were written in Latin, accessible only to a select few. This was part of a system that guarded its secrets, keeping the populace in ignorance. Fauchard broke this barrier too. He began to write, in his native French, in a simple, accessible style. He described his methods, his instruments, his observations, in detail, without concealment. This was unprecedented. He was opening doors that had remained closed for 1,000 years. He wasn't just sharing knowledge. He was making it available to anyone who wanted to learn, anyone who wanted to save lives. Thus was born not just a new practice, but a new philosophy of medicine, accessible, empirical, based on facts, not on faith. His books, written in plain language, became a challenge. This challenge was heard by those who had kept their knowledge under lock and key for centuries. Parisian doctors, Sorbonne professors, members of the Royal Academy of Surgery. These were the true powers in medicine. They lived in a world where reputation was built on ancient titles, not on real results. And suddenly, some self-taught man, a former naval surgeon, dares not just to treat, but to openly teach, to publish his methods in the language of commoners. This was unheard of. It was a threat to their position, their income, their monopoly on truth. Accusations poured in immediately. Pierre Fauchard, a charlatan. His methods, dangerous quackery. His publications, an infringement on sacred medical dogmas. Who is he to teach us? The esteemed academics questioned. Where are his diplomas? Where are his titles? They pointed to his lack of formal education, his low social status as a simple surgeon, not a noble physician. Dental diseases, in their opinion, were the domain of barbers and chiropodists, a lower class, not even permitted to approach high science. And Fauchard not only devalued their status, he turned them into a subject of serious study. This was an insult. Doctors, accustomed to ritualistically reading ancient texts, could not accept his empirical approach. They called his experiments barbarism, dangerous human trials. They claimed his fillings poisoned the body and his instruments destroyed teeth. Ban his books, ban his practice, expel him from Paris. Such was their verdict. They saw him not as an innovator, but as a subverter, destroying centuries-old foundations. Their world, built on authority, was crumbling. But Fauchard, strangely enough, found powerful protectors. Not among academics, no. Among those who saw the real results of his work. Nobles, officials, even some members of the royal family, who were fortunate enough to become his patients, or whose servants were saved from agonizing pain. They saw how Fauchard relieved suffering that had previously been considered inevitable. They saw how he saved teeth that others simply extracted. Not theory, but practice. Not empty promises, but healing. These influential patrons, struck by his skill, interceded for him. They used their influence to protect him from the persecution of envious colleagues. They provided him with access to patients, to resources. They understood that Fauchard was not just treating teeth. He was saving lives. He was restoring people's ability to eat, speak, and smile without pain. Their support became a shield that protected him from the fury of the conservative system. Without them, his revolution could have been stifled in its infancy, and his name erased from history like that of another charlatan. But the protection of patrons gave him not only security, it gave him time. Time to systematize all his knowledge, all his discoveries, accumulated over decades of painstaking practice. He didn't just treat, he documented. He didn't just invent, he described. And in 1728, when he was already 50 years old, Pierre Fauchard presented his work to the world. 2 voluminous books, over 800 pages, hundreds of illustrations. The title was simple and bold: The Surgeon Dentist, or a Treatise on Teeth. This was not just another medical treatise written in Latin for the elite. It was a comprehensive, extremely precise encyclopedia of a new science, written in French. Each chapter of The Surgeon Dentist was a blow against ignorance. Fauchard didn't just describe diseases. He provided detailed anatomical information about teeth and jaws, knowledge that hadn't existed in such volume before him. He classified diseases, explained their causes, and proposed specific methods of diagnosis and treatment. He described dozens of his instruments, their purpose, and technique of use. He taught how to make fillings, how to treat gums, how to extract teeth with minimal trauma. Moreover, he included a chapter on oral hygiene, a concept that then seemed absurd, but today is the basis of preventive medicine. He even detailed how to make dentures from ivory, demonstrating that tooth loss was not a death sentence. The publication of The Surgeon Dentist was not just the release of a book. It was a public challenge. Academics, accustomed to abstract reasoning, were confronted with irrefutable facts. Their accusations of charlatanism shattered against thousands of pages of concrete, verifiable data. The book was not just theory. It was a practical guide that anyone who wanted to learn could pick up. It provided answers where there had only been questions. It offered solutions where only pain had reigned before. The Sorbonne doctors could not ignore this work. It was read. It was discussed. And most importantly, its methods worked. Patients, relieved of suffering, were living proof of his correctness. Fauchard's book instantly became a bestseller. It was translated into German, English, and then other languages, spreading his knowledge across Europe. Several reeditions were published within a few years. Thus, without a formal trial or academic examination, Pierre Fauchard won his greatest victory. His name, whispered just yesterday as that of a dangerous eccentric, was now spoken with respect. He became not just a surgeon but a teacher, to whom people from all over Europe traveled to learn from his experience. He opened the first school for dentists in history, albeit unofficial, transmitting his knowledge to students. His office became the center of a new science. Exiled and despised, he became an acknowledged master, an undisputed authority. He didn't just change the approach to dental treatment, he created an entire profession. He became the father of modern dentistry. With the publication of The Surgeon Dentist, knowledge for centuries enshrined in dogmas took on a new form. It became a guide to action. For the first time, practicing doctors, now calling themselves dentists, received not just theory, but a clear treatment protocol. They learned not only to extract, but also to preserve. Carious cavities, previously signifying inevitable tooth loss, were now cleaned and filled. These were the first steps toward restorative dentistry, toward the idea that what was damaged could be restored. Hygiene, previously considered a whim, became an integral part of prevention. Fauchard didn't just advocate for cleaning teeth. He explained why it was important, how it prevented diseases. And it worked. The number of purulent abscesses, which previously often led to sepsis and death, decreased. Mass infections originating in the oral cavity gradually receded. The number of deaths caused by a simple tooth abscess significantly reduced. There was no longer a need to endure agonizing suffering leading to exhaustion and fatal outcomes. People stopped dying from toothache. Throughout Europe, informal and then official, schools based on Fauchard's principles began to open. His book became the Bible for a new generation of specialists. From barbershops and blacksmiths, where teeth were mindlessly pulled, emerged people capable of diagnosing, treating, and even creating prostheses. Dental practitioners became a separate, recognized profession, requiring specialized knowledge and skills. The University of Paris, which had previously scorned Fauchard, was forced to acknowledge the importance of his discoveries. Medical faculties began to include the fundamentals of odontology, the science of teeth, in their programs. This revolution changed not only medicine, it changed the lives of millions of people. A smile ceased to be a sign of pain. The ability to eat normally, speak, and live without chronic suffering This was a return to basic human dignity. From now on, toothache was not a death sentence. It became a challenge for which science had an answer, and that answer was provided by one man who dared to see order in chaos and an opportunity for salvation in suffering. Pierre Fauchard had no diplomas. He did not belong to the elite. He was a simple surgeon, an outsider who challenged a 1,000-year-old dogma, and it was his desperate, methodical struggle against pain and ignorance that gave birth to a new science. The paradox of his legacy is that the man rejected by the academic system himself created the system that replaced the decaying dogmas. He proved, true progress does not wait for academic recognition. It is not born in the quiet of offices, but forged in the crucible of real practice. It demands the courage to doubt the unshakable. It demands the persistence to observe when others close their eyes. And it demands the willingness to share knowledge, even if that knowledge goes against established norms. His legacy is not only millions of saved teeth and restored smiles. It is an eternal reminder, an echo through the centuries. The deepest, most monumental changes come not from those who guard old dogmas, who cling to the authority of the past. They come from those who dare to dismantle them, building anew on the foundation of real experience, despite ridicule, threats, and centuries of resistance. The story of Pierre Fauchard is not just a chapter in a medical textbook. It is a universal lesson on how one person can rewrite rules that seemed unshakable if they dare to be a pioneer, even when the whole world is against them.